my fellow freedom low sovereign thinkers. Thank you for tuning in to LO3 podcast. My name is Craig, transmitting from the beautiful swampy mangroves of South Florida. And today's date is Saturday, January 9th, 2020. Looks like there's a lot of chaos that's happening as we speak in the technocratic perspective. Censorships everywhere, deplatforming, including President Trump. Even there's censorship in New Zealand with Vinnie Eastwood. Am I surprised? Absolutely not. A lot of us have been talking about this for years, been preparing for this horrific moment. It looks like everyone's running scared. There's claims that they had Northam deploy troops in Virginia to surround the White House, lock it down. Well, it's just another reason why he's a treasonous parasite, New World Order CCP stooge. It's not that difficult. It's self-explanatory. All you gotta do is listen to his rhetoric and examine his campaign and his platform. And I digress on that matter. And even people on Facebook and Twitter think it's great that certain people being just shadow bans, definite suspensions, etc. I'll tell you this. You're one of the most not too informed, bright individuals out there. You're playing in their trap. You go after Trump supporters, gunning for them, I think it's hilarious. But when the same parasites you are cheering for go after you, you're going to get a lot more than you can consume. This is not a game. This is very dangerous indeed. They think it's okay to censor. Here's the thing. If you read the community guidelines and you agree on it, and there's nothing, if you don't do anything egregious, you know what? That's called breach of contract. How many of you suckers out there never taken the issue of examining these things? Never saying assume. A lot of assumaholics, or conformists, walking antimatter, all being exposed for who you really are. And it's very disappointing to say that, because we're supposed to be enlightening one another, but of course, always going to have the doubtful Thomases of the world. That's one of the areas you always gotta think before you speak, and that includes myself. And I'll say that out of fairness. And they're gunning for everybody. You got the sedition of the House, the soon majority wimp, and possibly the minority wuss. Whether it's in the House and the Senate, on the wimp and the wuss. All part of the New World Order propaganda machine. Yeah. That Puritan ideology, liberty for me and none for thee. All part of that herd conformity program. Yeah, I'm very disturbed, a lot of folks out there. Because, like I said, if it backfires on you, don't you ever come crying to me. Let's repent for your stupidity. And a lot of it needs to be done. Well, just an example of the war on terror is the war on the people. Now it's going to celebrate here in this republic. To all the constitutional illiterates out there, you don't want to implement, but have someone else do it for you. Uncle Toms and Aunt Jemimas on an ethical basis. House and field peasants. Yeah. Kio Bono, who benefits on this matter? Not you and I. Well, enough of my rant on this. I'm going to start it off. It came from the Free Thought Project, but shared on activist posts. The government's new war on terror is coming this time. It's coming. This time it aims at America. Here's what Matt Agris has to say. After the storming of the Capitol building on Wednesday, mainstream media and establishment voices began throwing around a term should make us all pay attention: domestic terrorism. As a group of MAGA rioters stormed the Capitol to take selfies with cops, steal podiums, and hang from banisters, President-elect Joe Biden quickly took his platform to characterize them as domestic terrorists. Don't dare call them protesters, Biden said in remarks from Wilmington, Delaware. They were a riotous mob, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists. It's that basic, it's that simple. And I'll tell you this, and my add on that is that dramatic. You don't know what insurrection means? Look it up. Unfortunately, during the turmoil, a police officer was killed and a protester shot to death, as well as 3 other individuals who were apparently part of the MAGA protest and died from medical emergencies. Well, it was certainly terrible. This right does not come close to the description Biden gave it, calling it one of the darkest days in the history of our nation. Really, Joe? Was it? Was this really one of the darkest days in the history of our nation? Was it darker than thousands of people dying on 9/11? Was it darker than sending thousands of troops to their death in Iraq and Afghanistan for no reason? Which he supports these things, okay? Supporting imperialism. That's what Joe Biden is, okay? Was it darker than Stephen Paddock murdered 60 people in Las Vegas and wounded hundreds of others, or when Nicholas Cruz murdered all those children? Was it darker than the day on May 13, 1985, when the police department bombed the homes of a black liberation group called MOVE, killing 11 people, 5 of them who were children? Was it darker than a fateful day on June 1st, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when police helped terrorists murder 300 of the most successful black people in America? Was it darker than when a bloodthirsty army of U.S. Cavalry members slaughtered over 500 peaceful Native Americans living in a village at Sand Creek? Was it darker than the time at least 150 African Americans were murdered in Colfax, Louisiana, after multiple white supremacist groups created a militia and attacked the courthouse building? Was it darker than when 300 Native Americans were shot and killed in the late 1890, the majority of whom were women and children, after the United States military 7th Cavalry regime surrounded a camp of Lakota tribe along South Dakota's Wounded Knee Creek? Or was it darker than thousands of lives taken by cops every year in this country? No, Joe. No, it was not. But Biden likely knows that it wasn't that dark of a day. Biden likely knows that had police responded like they do to police brutality protests, no MAGA folks would ever made it inside the Capitol that day. Biden also likely knows that it wasn't really a coup, as unarmed people carrying Blue Lives Matter and Trump 2020 flags does not a coup make. Biden most likely knows that it was just a group of devout fans of an arrogant demagogue making poor decisions after getting duped by their leader into thinking that they had a chance to overturn the results of the election. However, in order for the government to capitalize on the capital intent, Biden needs to keep narrative going that these weren't simply angry soccer moms, business owners, and veterans with a few extremists mingled in who were willing to get violent. They were all evil domestic terrorists who represented 80 million other Americans, because that's how you get a passed new and draconian legislation to usurp more freedoms. You stoke irrational fear. And that is exactly what President-elect Biden is doing. Just like Trump used police brutality riots to justify signing an executive order authorizing up to 10 years in prison for injury of federal property, then that will now be used against his supporters as he makes off with the millions they donated to him. Biden is using assault on the Capitol to expand the police state. Biden came out the day after the breach of the Capitol to explicitly state that he had made it a priority of passing a law against domestic terrorism. He has been urged to create a White House post overseeing the fight against ideologically inspired violent extremists and increasing funding to combat them, according to the Wall Street Journal. This new war on terror, just like the old war on terror, will have a bipartisan support and will likely fly through the House and Senate and quickly become law. As Glenn Greenwald writes, liberals who are behind the Biden-Harris plan to initiate this new war on terror, this time with a primary domestic focus, won't need to study what neocons did in the first war on terror to learn those old tactics against critics. Neocons are their full allies in all of this. So it's not a partisan thing, folks. It's tyranny against liberty. That's what he's saying. And Glenn Greenwald is right. Greenwald points out a threatening similarity with the first war on terror that anyone is who questions the state's tactics, or even though they were unjust murders and criminals, was still lumped in with the enemy and considered a terrorist sympathizer. I spent the first decade of my journalism career devoted to exposing and denouncing the excesses of the first war on terror, and I see exactly the same tactics forming. If you question or are concerned about these new powers, you'll be branded as a sympathetic to the terrorists, writes Greenwald. The fact is that this has been in the works for years, and the oligarchs were simply waiting for an event to trigger it. The MAGA folks played right into their hands, and Wednesday will serve as a catalyst for deploying these tactics. So you could say the MAGA folks that got involved in this became the patsies, the pawns, the unintentional pawns, the entrapped pawns, to be exact. But we all know for sure, based on all the videos we see, thanks to the citizen journalist, it was a false flag done by design, or other words, socially engineered incident. As we reported in 2019, the FBI classified those who share conspiracy theories online as a domestic terror threat, but it goes even further. In fact, in spite of having no reason to go after conspiracy theorists and patriot groups, the government has a long history of infiltrating groups and labeling those who question the status quo as a threat. Even has a name, PACON, short for Patriot Conspiracy. Definitely going to add that to my memo. Indeed, much of the police state, which has risen around the country, is in response to the essentially non-existent threat from those who want to expose the crimes of the state, who are labeled as extremist groups. YouTube and Google have gotten in on the action and have moved to censor evidence on the U.S. war crimes and historical footage of war. Indeed, much of the police state, which has risen up around the country, is in response to the essentially non-existent threat from those who want to expose the crimes of the state, who are labeled as extremist groups. YouTube and Google have gotten in on the action and have moved to censor evidence of U.S. war crimes and historical footage. Footage of war. One moment. Sorry about that. I had the hiccups here. In August of 2013, Concord, New Hampshire Police Chief John Duvall secretly contacted Homeland Security and demanded an armored vehicle due to the alleged threat posed by peaceful libertarians. The MIAC report, a federal training document famously presented to Missouri police in 2009, went as far as falsely trying supporters of former presidential candidate Ron Paul and the Constitution to extremist groups as well. That is right, the MIAC report. Definitely look that up, folks. There's a link to this page too, so definitely you should all need to pay attention on what is happening. Okay? I'll just take that off. All right. In 2014, a sheriff's deputy admitted on video that these weapons of war were needed to fend off constitutions for firearms. The sheriff's deputy. See, this is how cowardly these people are, all right? It is important to point out that are indeed extreme factions within the Trump base and other extremist groups who are white supremacists who might carry out acts of terror. However, they are not representative of the entire pro-freedom base. Rest assured that this does not matter, and anyone who questions the establishment from this point forward will be branded as an extremist, potential domestic terrorist. While QAnon, and other groups have certainly put on ridiculous claims, this push for domestic war and terror subsequently ensnares millions of innocent people for doing nothing other than questioning their government. As stated above, there is no doubt that crazy people who believe in conspiracy theories carry out crazy acts. It is highly likely, in fact, that the most domestic terrorists have acted based on some irrational conspiracy that they believed was real. But tens of millions of people don't act. Asking questions is the only way to figure out real conspiracies. This should never be considered domestic terrorism. In other words, you could be a thought criminal. To push to criminalize, the questioning the almighty federal government will also be coupled with a level of censorship like we have never seen. The New York Times and other mainstream media outlets and tech giants have already begun to roll out their plans for it. When the state ramps up this campaign of censorship, regardless of its intentions of preventing threats, it will be used to silence everyone who the establishment disagrees with. History proves this is to be the case every single time. As a German journalist and poet, Christian Johann Heinrich Heine family said, where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings. Okay? Yes, folks. A digital version of Fahrenheit 451. Because a few easily swayed individuals take tidbits of information and make brash decisions does not mean that this information should be stopped. If we look back over the past decades, we've witnessed the establishment media by their culprits of the most dangerous and deadly conspiracy theories of all time. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the Gulf of Tonkin, and the war on drugs are just a few of the conspiracy theories spread by the established media that have led to the death and suffering of millions. This move will solidify the future of the technocracy. As it all does, it further attack those who want peace and freedom. And it does so by blurring the lines between real extremists and freedom-loving activists. After all, if tyrants can associate hate and extremism with the idea of peace and liberty, the herd will be far easier to keep under control, will have no problem voting away their rights to fight that non-existent threat. Treason is truth in the empire of lies. I believe Congressman Dr. Ron Paul said that. Well, folks, many of us have been saying the war on terror is the war against ourselves, the humanity as a whole, including the folks here in the United States, just like the war on drugs, synonymous. And this is very extremely disturbing when many people out there, even the ones I know, catch the bait, hook, line, and sinker. And this is what I tell all the folks out there. If you have animosity and you say you hate fascism, or communism or Nazism, and you support these people being shadow banned and or deprive their right to speak their minds, then you emulate the ones you despise. Nothing more than hypocrites. Every single one of you to have that mindset. If I offend you, too bad, because you have no merit. How far this goes, it's up to all of us. Just to let you folks know, we do have a 10th Amendment. We can work on nullification. And there's plenty of resolutions on the table, including Virginia, Kentucky, and as many others. They started out in 1798 and has been emulated to other areas. And I've explained this multiple times. You folks just look this up. I encourage everyone to hit the 10thamendmentcenter.com and go to Chris Ann Hall, KRISANNE Hall.com. Hall is HALL, okay? Definitely check them out. They're fantastic people. But it's one of the reasons why, if you want to fight the real war on terror, you defend your Bill of Rights culture, period. And even with these TeknoAxe want to censor, get them for breach of contract. Screw every single one of them. Here's the thing: these social media sites, these big techs, they need us more. We need them. It's not that hard. There's plenty of areas you can go to counter these TeknoAxe. And I'm going to leave it at that. This next one here is very interesting here. This one came from Glenn Greenwald, greenwald.substack.com. It did came out yesterday, but I had to read this. It says here, violence in the Capitol, dangers in the aftermath. From the Cold War to the war on terror, the harms of authoritarian solutions are often greater than the threats they are ostensibly designed to combat. What do we have to say here? In days and weeks after the 9/11 attack, Americans were largely united in emotional horror at what had been done to their country, as well as in their willingness to endorse repression and violence in response. As a result, there was little room to raise concern about possible excesses of danger of the American reaction, let alone to dissent from what political leaders were proposing in the name of vengeance and security. The psychological trauma from the carnage and the wreckage at the country's most cherished symbols swamped rational faculties and thus rendered futile any attempts to urge restraint or caution. Nonetheless, a few tried, scorn and sometimes worse were universally heaped upon them. On September 14th, while bodies were still buried under the burning rubble in downtown Manhattan, Congresswoman Barbara Lee cast a lone vote against the authorization to use military force, AUMF. Some of us must urge the use of restraint, she said. 72 hours after the attack, adding our country is in a state of mourning, and thus some of us said, let's step back for a moment. Let's pause just for a minute and think through the implications of actions today, so that does not spiral out of control. For simply urging caution at a casting signal, no vote against war, Lee's congressional office was deluged with threats of violence. Armed security was deployed to protect her, largely as a result of media attacks suggesting that she was anti-American and sympathetic to terrorists. Yet 20 years later, with U.S. troops still fighting in Afghanistan under the same AUMF, with Iraq destroyed, ISIS spawned, and U.S. civil liberties and privacy rights permanently crippled, her solitary admonitions look far more courage, prescience, and wisdom than sedition or desire to downplay the threat of Al-Qaeda. Others also raise similar questions and issue similar warnings. On the left, people like Susan Sontag, and Noam Chomsky. And on the right, people such as Ron Paul and Baxter Buchanan, in different ways at different times, urge U.S. politicians and Americans generally to resist unleashing an orgy of domestic assaults on civil liberties, foreign invasions, and an endless war posture. They warned that such a cycle, once initiated, would be very difficult to control, even more difficult to reverse, and virtually guaranteed to provoke even greater violence. These few who dissented from an instant consensus were, like Congresswoman Lee, while vilified, both Sontag and Chomsky were branded anti-American fifth columnists, while David Frum, writing National Review, denounced Buchanan and others questioning the access to the war on terror. From the right as unpatriotic conservatives, no different proclaimed the neocon than Noam Chomsky, Ted Rall, Gore Vidal, Alexander Cockburn, and other anti-Americans of the far left. And it's interesting here because there's some of the stuff we talked about. And I'll just leave this here, this article by David Frum. I respect and admire the French who have been a greater nation than we shall ever be. That is, if greatness means anything loftier than money and bonds. That's what Tom Flynn from Hard Right has to say. And this is what Dave Frum wrote. From the very beginning of the war on terror, there has been dissent, and as the war has proceeded to Iraq, this dissent has grown more radical and more vociferous. Perhaps this was to be expected, but here is what never could have. In retrospect, it's hard to deny those who defy or at least question the potent 2001 emotional consensus by urging deliberation in lieu of reactionary rage were vindicated by subsequent events, 2 decades expansion of the war in Afghanistan and multiple countries, the enactment of the Patriot Act, the secret implementation of the mass surveillance system, the trillions of dollars of taxpayers' wealth transferred to weapons manufacturers, the paramilitarization of the domestic security state, and at the very least, basic rationality because of acknowledgement that when political passion and rage-driven emotions find their most extension expressed, because of reflection and caution can only be valuable if ultimately rejected. Yesterday's invasion, so it's interesting there, so keep going here. Yesterday's invasion of the Capitol by a Trump-supporting mob has certainly generated intense political passion and pervasive rage. It's not hard to understand why. Introduction of political force into political protest is always lamentable, usually dangerous, and except in the rarest of circumstances that are plainly inapplicable here, unjustifiable. It was, let's say here, it's interesting because when you look at here, it was foreseeable that an action of this type would result in death. The most surprising outcome is that only 4 people died: an unarmed woman, a Trump supporter, and an Air Force veteran who was shot in the neck by a law enforcement officer, and other 3 protesters who died from unspecified medical emergencies. One reportedly died due to accidentally tasering himself, including a heart attack. U.S. Capitol remains potent and cherished symbol, even for Americans who are deeply cynical about the ruling class and political system. It is notably something continually ingrained deep into our collective psyche since childhood, and that meanings endures even when our rational faculties reject it. It is therefore not hard to understand why watching the marauding band of hooligans invade and deface both the House and the Senate without any identifiable objective other than when inventing grievances reflexively engenders a patriotic disgust across the political spectrum. It is unhinged to the point of being obsessed to compare yesterday's inclusion to the 9/11 attacks, or as Senator Chuck Schumer did last night, to Pearl Harbor. See, another drama queen, a Pinocchio, career politician. They're just talking out of their rear ends, folks. You know how it goes. By every metric, the magnitude and destructiveness of those 2 events are in an entirely different universe, but that does not mean there are no applicable lessons to be drawn from those prior attacks. One is that striking at cherished national symbols, the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the Capitol, ensures rage and terror far beyond body counts of other concrete harms. This was one of the major reasons that yesterday's event received far more attention and contemporary commentary, and will likely produce far greater consequences than much deadlier incidences, such as still motive unknown 2011 Las Vegas mass shooting that killed 59, which I consider that Gladio-style attack, or the 2016 Orlando shooting that left 49 people dead at the Pulse nightclub. Unlike even horrific indiscriminate shooting sprees, an attack on a symbol of national power would be perceived as an attack on the state or even society itself. There are other more important historical lessons not drawn not only from 9/11 attack, but subsequent terrorism in U.S. soil. One is the most important of resisting the coercive framework that demands everyone choose to one or two extremes. That the incident is either A, significant or even justifiable, or B, is an earth-shattering, radically transformative event that demands radical, transformative state responses. This reductive binary framework is any intellectual and dangerous. One can condemn a particular act while resisting the attempt to inflate the dangers it poses. One can acknowledge that the real existence of a threat while also warnings of the harm, often far greater from proposed solutions. One can reject maximalist, inflammatory rhetoric about an attack or a war of civilizations, an attempted coup, an insurrection, sedition, without being fairly accused or of indifference toward or word sympathy for the attackers. Indeed, the primary focus of the first decade of my journalism was the U.S. war on terror, in particular the relentless erosions of civil liberties and the endless militarization of American society in the name of waging it. To make that case, those who should be opposed, I frequently argue that the threat posed by Islamic radicalism to U.S. citizens was being deliberately exaggerated, inflated, and melodramatized. I argue that not because I believe the threat was non-existent or trivial. I live in New York City on 9/11 and remember to this day the excruciating horror from the smell of smoke emanating throughout Lower Manhattan and haunting missing posters appended by desperate families unwilling to accept the obvious reality of their loved one's death. To every lamppost on every street corner, I share the same disgust and sadness as most other Americans for the Pulse massacre, the subway bombings in London and Madrid, the workplace mass shooting in San Bernardino. Okay, I always get these tongue ties. Good grief. My insistence that we look at the other side of the ledger and costs and dangers not only from such attacks, but also the solutions implemented in the name of stopping them. It did not come from indifference towards those deaths or a naive view of those responsible for them. It was instead driven by a simultaneous recognition of the dangers from rights eroding, authoritarian reactions imposed by the state, particularly in the immediate aftermath of traumatic event. One need not engage in denialism or minimalization of a threat to rationally resist far-driven fanaticism, as Barbara Lee so eloquently insisted on September 14, 2001. Human memories are usually short, and the dominance of social media has abridged them even further. May have forgotten the Clinton administration seized on the 1995 court bombing in Oklahoma City to radically expand law enforcement powers and escalate its demands for full-scale backdoor access to all encrypted internet communications. The fear necessary to justify such draconian measures was fueled by incessant media hyping of weekend citizen militias in places like Idaho and Montana said to be plotting armed insurrection against the federal government. One of the first major war on terror attacks on core constitutional rights, which I wrote about, was Newt Gingrich's 2006 speech, suggesting that the First Amendment speech guarantee to fight terrorism should be modified. Exactly, and he said that this is right here. It's very interesting. He says, right here. I'll just leave it here. Former House Speaker previously cited a commentary article by former federal prosecutor Andrew McCarthy entitled "Free Speech for Terrorists," insisting that some ideas are so dangerous, especially in the era of terrorism and the internet, that the First Amendment must be limited to permit greater censorship powers. Okay, Newt Gingrich, all you Republicans out there that support this man in 2012 always need to pay attention. With an enemy committed to terrorism, the advocacy of terrorism, the threats, the words are not mere dogma or even calls to action. They are themselves weapons of incitement and intimidation, often as effective in achieving their ends as would-be firearms and explosive brandished openly. Do we so lack confidence except in the sacrosanct status of speech itself that we are enabled to say with assurance that some things are truly evil and that advocating them not only fails to serve any socially desirable purpose but guarantees more evil? Must our historical deference to opinion, however noxious, defers as well to call arms against innocents or call destroy a form of representative government that protects religious and political freedom? May we not even ban and criminalize the advocacy of militant Islam and its media, which is indiscriminate slaughter of civilians? In America, bounteous market, there are no limits on words as building blocks of ideas or of ideas as a legitimate instrument of persuasion. Terror has no place in such discourse. It is a function of law to express a society's judgment. Ours should be simple and humane. Words that are kill are not words we need to abide. As a free speech activist and a civil libertarian, this is Greenwald saying now, as a free speech advocate and a civil libertarian, I was naturally repelled by this notion that some political ideas could be deemed so dangerous by the state that can be legally suppressed. In response, I asked rhetorically in 2006, are there any American values at all in which Bush followers and neocons actually believe? Any constitutional principles that are sacrosanct at those at whose violations they would oppose if undertaken in the name of fighting the terrorists? I concluded it certainly doesn't appear so. I always admire his work. I'm sorry, folks. So beyond raising alarms about liberty erosion, I often insisted that the underlying cause of terrorism aimed at the U.S. should be considered it for no other reason than to understand how to address it without destroying core liberties for Americans. While religious fanaticism may sometimes be the cause, far more often, I argue, such attacks were motivated by rage over killing of innocent people, including children, by the U.S. government bombs, drones, tanks in Muslim-majority countries. Right-wing advocates often demonize such arguments as pro-terrorist or as justifying terrorist attacks, but the left largely support the inquiry into motivating causes as they, just as they have long supported the attempts to understand which motivates violent crime on the ground that misguided actions are often driven by valid, at least widely shared, redressable grievances. But the view that we should attempt to identify the core motives of the terrorist acts or violent crime rather than just label them evil and vow to destroy their perpetrators was largely deemed taboo in mainstream discourse. It is such a stunning to watch. Now, as every war on terror rhetorical tactic to justify civil liberties erosions is now being invoked in the name of combating Trumpism, including the aggressive exploitation of emotions triggered by yesterday's event at the Capitol to accelerate their implementation and demonize dissent over quickly formed consensus. The same framework used to assault civil liberties in the name of foreign terrorism is now being seamlessly applied, often by those who spent the last 2 decades objecting it to the threat posed by domestic white supremacist terrorists, the term preferred by liberal elites, especially after yesterday for Trump supporters generally. In so many ways, yesterday was liberals 9/11, as even the most sensible commentators among them are resorting to the most unhinged rhetoric available. Within hours of the Capitol being cleared, we heard truly radical proposals from numerous members of Congress, senators and House members who objected to Electoral College certification or questioned its legitimacy should be formally accused of sedition and expelled from the House, if not prosecuted, argued Representative Cori Bush. All right, with other House members expressed support. Even those unarmed protesters who peacefully entered the Capitol should many argue, be hunted by FBI as domestic terrorists. So you see this double speak these politicians like to do. It happens on both sides, so it doesn't matter if you're part of the red or blue team. Okay, calls proliferated from the banning of the social media accounts of instigators and protest participants. Journalists and politicians cheered the decision by Facebook and Twitter to temporarily bar the president from using their service, and then cheered again when Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced on Tuesday that the ban on Trump extended through Biden's inauguration. Some journalists, such as CNN's Oliver Darcy, complained that Facebook had not gone far enough, that more mass censorship was needed for right-wing voices. See, all you folks that are CNN supporters, based on this, Oliver Darcy don't give a damn about your rights, okay? That person is the enemy, including you. Well, the once radical 2006 Gingrich argument that some opinions are too dangerous to allow to be expressed because they are pro-terrorist and insurrectionary is now thriving close to a consensus. These calls for censorship online officials are grounded in the long discredited, oft rejected, and dangerous views that a person should be legally accountable not only for their own illegal actions, but also for the consequences of their protected speech. Meaning the actions of others that take when they hear inflammatory rhetoric. That was the distorted mentality used by the state of Mississippi in the 1970s to try to hold NAACP leaders liable for violent acts of their followers against boycott violators after hearing rousing pro-boycott speeches from the NAACP leaders. Only for the Supreme Court in 1982 unanimously reject such efforts on the ground that while the state legitimately may oppose damages for the consequence of violent conduct, it may not award compensation for the consequences of non-violent protected activity. Adding that the advocacy of the use of force or violence does not remove speech from the protection of the First Amendment. The complete reversal mentality from just a few months ago is dizzy. Those who spent the summer demanding the police be defunded are furious that the police response at the Capitol was sufficiently robust, violent, and aggressive. Oh yeah, well, that's what happened. You want to start, hey, that's what happened when you talk about defunding, right? Welcome to blowback. Oh man, I get a big kick out of this. Don't get me wrong. I know it's a little bit long, folks, but I'm almost done here. I'm going to keep on. Now, so those urged to abolition of prisons are demanding Trump supporters be in prison for years. Those who are under the banner of anti-fascism demand the firing top New York Times editor for publishing the op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, Republican from Arkansas, advocating the deployment of U.S. military to quell riots. A view deemed not just wrong but unspeakable in decent society. Are today furious that the National Guard was not deployed at the Capitol to quash pro-Trump supporters. And if advocates are working to expose the names of Capitol protesters to empower the FBI to arrest them on terrorism charges. And while Representative Cori Bush's proposal to unseat members of Congress for their subversive views went mega viral, many forget, in 1966. The Georgia State Legislature refused to seat Julian Bond after he refused to repudiate his anti-war work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, then considered a domestic terrorist group. See, you see what's going on? It's a game of witch hunting. It's been going on for millenniums, folks. And you still want to go for this mentality program? You just a lost cause and you failed history. Don't even talk to me on the street. Alright, I'm going to continue on here. Those who argue in the summer that property damage is meaningless or even noble are treating smashed windows and looted podiums at the Capitol as treason, as a coup. One need not dismiss the lamentable actions of yesterday and simultaneously reject efforts to apply terms that are apparently inapplicable: attempted coup, insurrection, sedition. There was zero chance that a few hundred people who breached the Capitol could overthrow the U.S. government. The most powerful armed and militarized entity in the world, nor did they try. Perhaps many view it as more upsetting to see August members of Congress hiding in the fear of a riot than to watch ordinary small business owners weep as their multi-generation store burns to the ground. Undoubtedly, national reporters who spent much time in the Capitol and who have been long friends with senators and House members are more horrified, far more so, by violent gangs in the Capitol Rotunda than on the streets of Portland or Kenosha. But that does not mean that rational resistance is unnecessary when searching for sober language to accurately describe these events. There is a huge difference between, on one hand, thousands of people shooting their way into the Capitol after a long-planned, coordinated plot with the goal of seizing permanent power. On the other, an impulsive, grievous-driven crowd, more waltzing into the Capitol as a result of the strength in numbers and then leaving a few hours later. The only person shot was a protester killed an armed agent of the state. Is itself clear how irresponsible these terms are. These are more adjectives besides fascist treason and harmless protest. Enormous space between those two poles. One should not be forced between the two. It's interesting. This is what Representative Jason Cruz say. We stopped the coup attempt and we'll be returning to the Capitol today to finish the business of people who never back down. We will return. Okay, well, he's from Colorado, Democrat from Colorado. I'm almost done here, folks, in this matter. It's been long clear that in the post-Trump era, media outlets looking to keep viewers hooked and government officials looking to increase their power will do everything possible to center and inflate the threat posed by right-wing factions. I've said this more times than I could count over the last year at least. Like all inflated threats, this one has a kernel of truth. It's true of every faction. There are right-wing activists filled with rage who are willing to engage in violence. Some of them are dangerous, just as some Muslims in post-9/11 era, and some Antifa nihilists who are generally violent and dangerous. But as was true the Cold War and the War on Terror, so many other crises spurred reactions. The other side of the ledger, the draconian state powers, clearly being planned and urged and prepared in the name of stopping them, carries its own extreme formidable dangers. Refusing to consider those dangers for fearing of standing accused of downplaying the threat is the most common tactic authoritarian advocates of the state power use. Less than 24 hours after the Capitol breach, one sees this tactic being wielded with great flamboyance and potency, and is sure to continue long after January 20th. In other words, you got a lot of pundits and political hacks that want to gaslight it. And like I said before, when you come to when it comes to imperialism, supporting another unconstitutional centralization, imperialism, and practicing other unconstitutional acts. On that aspect, got it where it is today. Of course, they got the rubber rousers, the hired guns, getting involved. Happens all the time. Even happens, with the protests around the country with George Floyd. Even in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, you're always going to have the provocateurs get people going. And what's great, because that's why I always tell folks, don't rely on the mainstream garbage media. Focus on the citizen journalists. They get it in the raw. And I've seen both sides, whether it was George Floyd or this case. People were grabbing the infiltrators, saying, what the hell are you doing? Calling them out or taking them down. I've seen it from both ends. This is why you always got to beware of these potential false flag events, Gladio B style attacks. It's all part of the game plan. It's all traditional. And of course, you got tyrants in there are licking their chops. Doesn't matter if they're Democrat or Republican. Many of them don't care what you think. Like I said before, government in Latin means control of the mind. So if you support all these people getting their stuff taken down and you're laughing about it, you became your own enemy. Because if it happens to you, don't complain. That's the bottom line. I'm gonna do one more here on Deplatforming. I know it's almost close to an hour, and I'm sorry about that. I have a habit of narrating stuff. It'll be the last one for the night. I'll probably do another show later on. It says here, we need more deplatforming. This is from Mozilla's blog. This came out yesterday. Right, Mitchell Baker. There's no question that social media played a role in the siege and takeover of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Since there has been a significant focus on deplatforming of President Donald Trump, by all means, the question of when to deplatform a head of state is a critical one among many that must be addressed. When should platforms make decisions? Is that decision-making power theirs alone? But as reprehensible as the actions of Donald Trump are, the rampant use of the internet to foment violence and hate and reinforce white supremacy. See, another BS artist, but I'll continue on here, is about more than any one personality. Trump is certainly not the first politician to exploit the architecture on the internet this way, and he won't be the last. We need solutions that don't start after untold damage has been done. Changing these dangerous dynamics requires more than just temporary silencing or permanent removal of bad actors from social media platforms. This is what he says. Additional, precise and specific actions must also be taken. Review who is paying for advertisements, how are they paying, and who is being targeted. Commit to meaningful transparency of platform algorithms so we know what content is being amplified to whom and associate impact. Turn on by default the tools to amplify factual voices of disinformation. Work with independent resources to facilitate in-depth studies on the platform, impact on people and our societies, and what we can do to improve things. These are actions the platforms can and should commit today. The answer is not to do away with the internet, but to help build a better one that can withstand and grid against these types of challenges. This is how we can begin to do that. Well, this is, you could say, J. Edgar Hoover is climaxing in his grave. Well, sorry, Mitchell Baker. I haven't used Mozilla for a long time, and I'm very proud of it. Because I remember what happened last time when they did some censoring. And you know what? I don't need you. So I recently uninstalled it. I feel real good. Haven't used it, so why should I use an app that's wasteful? Well, here's the thing, folks. These individuals are technocrats. And another thing, too, you got these diversified movements don't have to say any names, but you know what I'm talking about, have been funded by multinational corporations and technocrats. Now they want to witch hunt everyone consistently. Talk about Orwellian society, this is what they want. But I can tell you this, they're going to have one big battle on their hands. And I know one thing, liberty shall prevail. But the bottom line is, once again, they need us more we need them. And that will be it. I thank everyone for listening, but feel free to download and share us on social media networks. Any questions, comments, or anything you want to check out, whatever you do, please send your correspondence to Decorum. Furthermore, I'll definitely leave these articles on my speaker page. If you want to contact me, you can hit me at localluck3@gmail.com. Well, I prefer this one here, localluck03@protonmail.com. If you want to do a donation, you can hit me on paypal.me and cash.app/localluck3. Hit the donations, support guys, activist posts, Glenn Greenwald, and Free Thought Project. Okay, they need the love. Give it to them. That'd be great. All right. Once again, thank you for your time. Please always remember that demonic resistance is helpful to the soul and can liberate humanity. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Keep on spreading love, and may your guardian spirits be with you.